By the summer of 1941, the map of Europe had already been redrawn by the hand of Nazi Germany. Poland, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, all had fallen under the blows of the Wehrmacht. Great Britain, cut off by the strait, desperately resisted alone. The continent lay at Hitler's feet, who now turned his gaze eastward, where the Soviet Union stretched, the last obstacle on the path to absolute domination in Europe. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, concluded in '39, was merely a tactical pause in the eyes of the Führer. Behind the scenes of diplomatic smiles, an invasion plan of unprecedented scale was already being prepared. Operation Barbarossa. 3.5 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 2,000 aircraft. All of this stood poised along a 2,000-kilometer border, awaiting orders. The world stood on the brink of a military conflict unparalleled in the history of mankind. The ideology of Nazism was not a collection of random ideas. At its core lay a clear and sinister concept, developed by Adolf Hitler back in the 1920s. In his book Mein Kampf, written in Landsberg prison after the failed Munich Putsch, the future Führer outlined the idea of living space, Lebensraum. Eastern territories, primarily the lands of the Soviet Union, were seen as natural space for the expansion of the German nation. This was not merely a geopolitical theory, it was a racial doctrine. Slavic peoples, in the Nazi hierarchy, stood on the lowest steps. They were either to serve their German masters or disappear. 15 years passed from abstract ideas to concrete plans. In a narrow circle of confidants, Hitler repeatedly spoke of the inevitability of a confrontation with Bolshevism. For him, the USSR was not just a geopolitical adversary, but the nexus of Nazism's two main enemies, Bolshevism and Jewry, which in his distorted worldview coalesced into a single image of Judeo-Bolshevism. The directive for developing a plan for war against the Soviet Union was signed on December 18, 1940. Its codename, Barbarossa, referred to the medieval German emperor Frederick I, known as Barbarossa or Redbeard, who undertook a campaign to the east. The symbolism was obvious. A new German empire was continuing the work of its predecessors. The war in the east was initially planned as a war of annihilation. This is evidenced by the infamous Commissar Order, which prescribed the execution of Red Army political officers without trial. General Jodl, at a meeting in March 1941, explicitly stated, "This will be a struggle of ideologies and racial differences, and it must be waged with unprecedented, ruthless, and unrelenting severity." Special instructions were created for Wehrmacht soldiers, explaining that in the East, they were fighting against subhumans. Nazi economic plans envisioned the deliberate extermination of millions of Soviet citizens through starvation and displacement. Plan Ost, developed in parallel with military preparations, presupposed German colonization of the captured territories and the deportation or extermination of most of the local population. Thus, Operation Barbarossa was not just a military campaign. It was the first step in implementing a monstrous plan for the transformation of Eastern Europe, based on racial theory and the idea of living space. On July 22, 1940, just a month after the capitulation of France, General Oberst Franz Halder made a historic entry in his diary. "The Führer has decided. Russia must be liquidated. The deadline is spring 1941. Thus began the development of the largest military operation in human history. From the first sketches to the detailed plan, less than a year passed, a period of feverish work by the German General Staff. Initial ideas were formulated in a memorandum by Erich Marx, already in August 1940. He proposed delivering the main blow in the direction of Moscow, believing that the capture of the Soviet capital would lead to the collapse of the entire USSR control system. Simultaneously, General Erich von Manstein presented his considerations, suggesting focusing efforts on the southern direction to capture the economically important regions of Ukraine. The best strategic minds of the Wehrmacht participated in the development of the plan. Halder, Jodl, Brauchitsch, Paulus. The key figure was the Chief of the General Staff of the Army, Franz Halder, a methodical, meticulous strategist under whose leadership dozens of staff games and calculations were conducted. In December 1940, Hitler signed Directive No. 21, the official start of preparations for Operation Barbarossa. The plan was based on three fundamental principles that had already proven their effectiveness in Western Europe. The first was Blitzkrieg, a lightning war designed for the rapid defeat of the enemy. The second was the tactic of deep enveloping maneuvers with tank wedges to encircle large enemy groupings. The third was the destruction of the main forces of the Red Army in border battles, preventing their retreat deep into the territory. German strategists expected to complete the campaign in 8 to 10 weeks, reaching the Arkhangelsk-Astrakhan line. The final plan envisioned the advance of three army groups. North, under the command of Field Marshal von Lieb, was to capture the Baltic states and Leningrad. Center, under the leadership of von Bock, was to advance through Belarus to Moscow. South, headed by von Rundstedt, was to occupy Ukraine and move towards the Caucasus. By the summer of 1941, the German war machine had reached unprecedented power. Under the banners of the Wehrmacht, 3,800,000 soldiers were assembled for the invasion of the Soviet Union. A colossal armada, the like of which the world had never seen. This army was not exclusively German. It included Romanian, Hungarian, Finnish, Italian, and Slovak units, satellites of the Third Reich, drawn into the orbit of Nazi aggression. The core of its striking power consisted of tank formations, 3,600 armored vehicles, organized into 19 tank divisions. The sky above the advancing columns was to be controlled by 2,700 Luftwaffe aircraft. The artillery fist included 7,000 guns of various calibers. To transport this armada and supply it, 600,000 vehicles and 150,000 horses were mobilized. The German army, contrary to popular belief, was not fully motorized. The line of contact with Soviet troops stretched for 2,000 kilometers, from the Barents Sea to the Black Sea. German staff officers created a unique logistical system to support an offensive of such magnitude. New railway lines were laid, giant warehouses for ammunition and fuel were created, and field hospitals were deployed. Special attention was paid to transportation issues. After all, the Soviet railway gauge was wider than the European one, which required special solutions. Soldiers received summer uniforms and a supply of provisions for the first weeks of the campaign. Winter equipment was practically not provided for. The war was supposed to end before the onset of cold weather. So thought the German command. The Barbarossa operational plan envisioned an offensive along three strategic axes, each with its own specific aims and objectives. To realize this design, three powerful groupings were formed: Army Groups North, Center, and South. Each of them represented a true fist, capable of crushing Soviet defenses in its sector of the front. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, included the 16th and 18th Armies, as well as the 4th Panzer Group, a total of 29 divisions. Its strategic goal was the capture of Leningrad, the cradle of the revolution, and the second most important city in the Soviet Union. The German command believed that the fall of Leningrad would strike a devastating blow to the morale of the Soviet people. Furthermore, the capture of the city would allow for the establishment of a land connection with Finland and ensure control over the Baltic Sea. Along the central axis operated the most powerful grouping, Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. Its composition included the 4th and 9th Armies, as well as 2 panzer groups, the 2nd and 3rd, totaling 50 divisions. The main objective of this grouping was Moscow, the heart of the Soviet state, a key transport hub, and a political center. German strategists believed that with the fall of Moscow, the entire administrative system of the USSR would collapse, leading to the rapid disintegration of Soviet resistance. On the southern flank, Army Group South was deployed, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. This was the second most powerful grouping, comprising the 6th, 11th, and 17th German armies, the 1st Panzer Group, as well as Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian formations, a total of 57 divisions. Its task was the capture of Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union and a vital industrial region. Special importance was attached to the Donbass, with its coal mines and metallurgical enterprises, as well as the fertile black soil, which was to provide food for the Third Reich. Further advancement to the Caucasus was envisioned for the capture of oil fields. This division of efforts along 3 axes had its own internal logic. The German command sought to simultaneously achieve several strategic goals: destroy the main groupings of Soviet troops, capture key political centers, and establish control over vital economic regions. It was assumed that Army Group Center would reach Moscow within 8 to 10 weeks after the start of the invasion, and Army Groups North and South would complete their tasks within approximately the same time frame. However, this plan had a significant drawback: the dispersal of forces along 3 axes, which subsequently played a fatal role in the fate of the entire Barbarossa operation. On the eve of the German invasion, the Red Army found itself in a contradictory position. On the one hand, it was the largest army in the world: 5 million men, 23,000 tanks, 20,000 aircraft. On the other hand, it was an army undergoing a painful transformation. The repressions of 1937-1938 decapitated the Soviet armed forces. 3 out of 5 marshals, 13 out of 15 army commanders, and more than half of corps and division commanders were eliminated. Experienced military leaders were replaced by young officers who lacked sufficient experience in commanding large formations. General Pavlov, commander of the Western Special Military District, received this appointment just a few months before the war began. His predecessor had commanded the district for only a year. Such a leadership merry-go-round could not but affect the combat readiness of the troops. In parallel, a large-scale army reorganization was underway. The experience of the Soviet-Finnish War showed the need to create mechanized corps capable of conducting maneuver warfare. By June 1941, 29 such corps had been formed, but most of them existed only on paper. There was a shortage of tanks, vehicles, and communication equipment. The latest models of equipment, T-34 and KV tanks, Yak-1, MiG-3, IL-2 aircraft, were just beginning to arrive in the troops. Most crews did not have time to master these machines. The line of fortifications along the new border, the so-called Molotov Line, was under construction. Old fortified areas along the former border were partially disarmed. Soviet intelligence regularly reported on the concentration of German troops, but these reports were received contradictorily. Stalin feared provocations and was convinced that Hitler would not start a war without finishing the campaign against England. On June 14, TASS issued a famous statement refuting rumors of a possible war between the USSR and Germany. Even when German defectors reported the exact date of the attack, they were not believed. As a result, the directive to bring the troops to combat readiness was sent to the districts only on the night of June 22nd, when German troops had already taken up their initial positions for the offensive. 3 hours, 30 minutes in the morning of June 22nd, 1941. This moment forever divided history into before and after. In the pre-dawn silence, when most Soviet soldiers were still sleeping in their barracks, The engines of hundreds of German bombers roared over the western border of the USSR. Without a declaration of war, without diplomatic notes, only the roar of explosions and flashes of fires marking the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. The first targets of the Luftwaffe were Soviet airfields. The German command sought to destroy enemy aviation on the ground, preventing it from taking to the air. The tactic worked flawlessly. In the first hours, about 1,200 Soviet aircraft were destroyed, most of which didn't even have time to take off. While the bombers methodically destroyed the air shield of the USSR, German artillery opened a hurricane of fire on border outposts and fortifications. Through the smokescreen of the artillery barrage, crushing border barriers, the tank wedges of the Wehrmacht rushed forward. The advanced units of Soviet troops, stationed directly at the border, found themselves in a catastrophic situation. Communication was disrupted. Control was lost. Many commanders died in the first minutes of battle. Border guards engaged in combat, lacking heavy weaponry, often unaware of the general situation. In many border sections, German tanks broke through up to 15 kilometers deep within the first hours. By noon, the Wehrmacht's tank divisions had advanced 30 to 40 kilometers. In Moscow at this time, an atmosphere of confusion reigned. People's Commissar of Defense Timoshenko and Chief of the General Staff Zhukov tried to gather information about what was happening, but the reports were fragmented and contradictory. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Stalin was informed of the attack. He remained silent for a long time, not believing what had happened. Only at 7:15 in the morning did Molotov's address to the Soviet people sound on the radio. Today, at 4 o'clock in the morning, without any claims being presented to the Soviet Union, without a declaration of war, German troops attacked our country. The first directive sent to the troops demanded a counterattack against the enemy, but not to cross the state border. This order no longer corresponded to reality. In many sectors of the front, Soviet units were surrounded or pushed back tens of kilometers. By the end of the first day of the invasion, German troops had captured Grodno, Kobrin, Vladimir Volinsky. Soviet aviation lost about 1,800 aircraft. The suddenness of the strike played a fatal role. The mechanism of the blitzkrieg was launched, and its flywheel began its deadly rotation. The German blitzkrieg strategy fully manifested itself in the first weeks of the war. A classic example of its implementation was the encirclement of Soviet troops in the area of Bialystok and Minsk. Guderian's and Hoth's tank groups, advancing as part of Army Group Center, enveloped a significant portion of the Western Front, like gigantic pincers. Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group struck from the north, breaking through Vilnius, while Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group rapidly advanced from the south through Baranovichi. On June 28th, forward units of these groups met in the Minsk area, closing the encirclement ring. 3 Soviet armies, the 3rd, 10th, and part of the 4th, found themselves in the cauldron. Over 300,000 Red Army soldiers were captured, and thousands of units of equipment were lost. German generals triumphed. The first stage of Operation Barbarossa was implemented even ahead of schedule. The next major success of the Wehrmacht was the encirclement of Soviet troops near Uman in early August. Here, Kleist's 1st Panzer Group and the 17th Army encircled the 6th and 12th Soviet armies. Approximately 100,000 people were captured, including 2 army commanders, Ponedelin and Muzichenko. The tank pincers tactic worked with frightening efficiency. Fast-moving German tank divisions penetrated deep into the rear of Soviet troops, cutting off retreat and supply routes. The infantry followed, squeezing the encircled units. Coordination between tank and infantry formations was perfected. German tank wedges were supported from the air by Stuka dive bombers, which terrorized Soviet troops. The reasons for the success of German encirclements in the initial period of the war were complex. Firstly, the suddenness of the attack did not allow the Soviet command to organize an orderly withdrawal of troops. Secondly, The Wehrmacht's superiority in tactical training and experience in conducting modern maneuver warfare played a role. Thirdly, German troops had better communications and a more effective command and control system. Radios were in every German tank, while Soviet units often had only one radio per battalion. As a result, Soviet commanders often had no clear understanding of the situation and could not react promptly to the rapidly changing circumstances. German generals, encouraged by these successes, were confident that the main forces of the Red Army were already defeated and the path to Moscow was open. However, this confidence proved premature. Behind the front line, deep within Soviet territory, new divisions were being formed, and the resistance of surviving units became increasingly organized. As German tank wedges gnawed deeper into Soviet territory, the Wehrmacht faced a problem that staff strategists had underestimated during planning: logistics. With each kilometer advanced eastward, supplying the army became an increasingly complex task. The distances that trucks carrying fuel, ammunition, and provisions had to cover increased exponentially. By August 1941, forward units were 500 to 600 kilometers from their main supply bases. This created an enormous burden on the transportation system. The German army, designed for a lightning war, was not prepared for such logistical challenges. A single tank corps consumed up to 30 tons of fuel for every 100 kilometers of march. At the same time, the trucks delivering fuel themselves consumed a significant portion of the fuel they carried. A vicious circle emerged. The further the troops advanced, the more resources were required to maintain the supply system itself. The problem of railway communication became particularly acute. The track gauge in the USSR was 1,524 millimeters, while the European standard was 1,435. This difference of 89 millimeters turned into a real headache for the German command. They had to either re-gauge the tracks to the European standard or transload all cargo at the gauge change boundary. Special railway battalions worked around the clock, but the re-gauging rate was no more than 10 to 12 kilometers per day. For comparison, tank divisions at the beginning of the campaign advanced 40 to 50 kilometers daily. The gap between the front and railway stations constantly widened. The Soviet scorched earth tactic exacerbated supply problems. As they retreated, the Red Army soldiers destroyed bridges, railway junctions, water pumps, and power plants. German engineering units had to restore the infrastructure, which required additional time and resources. By the end of July, fuel reserves in tank divisions had dropped to critical levels. The commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, Guderian, noted in his memoirs that on some days his tanks could cover no more than 15 kilometers due to fuel shortages. The problem with spare parts was no less acute. Complex German equipment required regular maintenance, especially in conditions of poor roads and dust. By August, the Wehrmacht had lost more tanks due to technical malfunctions than in battles. Supply problems directly affected the combat effectiveness of the troops and the pace of the offensive. By mid-July, it was already clear that the original schedule for Operation Barbarossa was not being met. The 10th of July, 1941, marked a turning point in the implementation of Operation Barbarossa. On this day, the forward units of Army Group Center reached the Dnieper River and engaged in battles for Smolensk, an ancient Russian city on the path to Moscow. The Battle of Smolensk began, lasting until mid-September, and becoming the first serious setback for the German war machine. If previously Wehrmacht tank wedges cut through Soviet defenses like a knife through butter, now they faced fierce resistance. The 16th, 19th, and 20th Soviet armies, under the overall command of Marshal Timoshenko, fought with unprecedented tenacity. Especially fierce battles unfolded for Smolensk itself. The city changed hands repeatedly. German tanks broke into the center, but Soviet units counterattacked, dislodging the enemy. The commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, Guderian, for the first time encountered a situation where his armored fist could not crush the defense on the fly. The Soviet command learned lessons from the catastrophes of the first weeks of the war. Now, Red Army soldiers did not attempt to maintain a rigid defense line, but acted more flexibly, retreating to prepared positions and launching counterattacks into the flank of advancing columns. Near Smolensk, for the first time, BM-13 rocket launchers, dubbed Stalin's organs by the Germans and affectionately called Katyushas by Soviet soldiers, went into battle. Their salvos produced not only a physical, but also a powerful psychological effect on the enemy. On July 26th, Soviet troops launched a counterattack near Yelnya, creating the famous Yelnya salient, a wedge driven into the flank of the German offensive. The battles for this salient continued until the end of August and cost the Wehrmacht enormous losses. It was here that the first Soviet Guards divisions were born, units that displayed exceptional courage. The German command was forced to transfer additional forces to the Smolensk direction, withdrawing them from other sectors of the front. The pace of Army Group Center's advance sharply decreased. If in the first weeks of the war German tank divisions advanced 50 to 60 kilometers a day, now the count was in individual kilometers, each of which was gained with a fight. By mid-August, it became evident that the blitzkrieg on the central direction was faltering. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the Wehrmacht was forced to go on the defensive in certain sectors of the front. On July 30th, a historic meeting took place at Hitler's headquarters. Chief of the General Staff of the Army, Franz Halder, reported to the Führer that the pace of the advance on Moscow was insufficient, and losses exceeded estimates. He cited the unexpectedly strong resistance of Soviet troops and supply problems for stretched communications as the main reasons. The Battle of Smolensk forced the German command to seriously consider revising the entire plan for the Eastern Campaign for the first time. 38 Wehrmacht divisions became bogged down in protracted battles, expending a significant portion of their resources. Losses in manpower and equipment grew, and reinforcements arrived slower than required. For the first time since the start of Operation Barbarossa, doubts arose about the possibility of taking Moscow before winter. By mid-August 1941, the German command found itself facing a most complex strategic dilemma. The Battle of Smolensk, prolonged against all expectations, called into question the further fate of Operation Barbarossa. At a meeting at the Führer's headquarters, a sharp discussion unfolded, which historians would later call fateful for the entire Eastern Campaign. Army generals, led by Chief of the General Staff Franz Halder, insisted on continuing the offensive on Moscow. Their logic was simple and convincing. The Soviet capital was not only a political, but also a crucial transportation hub, through which about 70% of military transport passed. The capture of Moscow, in their opinion, would lead to the paralysis of the Red Army's command and supply system. Field Marshal von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, wrote in his memorandum, "The capture of Moscow will have not only military, but also colossal psychological significance. The fall of the capital will demoralize the enemy and deprive him of the will to resist." However, Hitler held a different opinion. Irritated by the slowdown in the pace of the offensive, he increasingly leaned towards changing the original plan. At a meeting on August 23rd, the Führer declared, "The most important goal before winter sets in is not the capture of Moscow, but the seizure of Crimea, the industrial and coal regions of Donbass, and the cutting off of supply routes for Caucasian oil." He pointed to a map where Ukraine was circled with a bold line. "Here are concentrated resources without which the Soviet war machine will not be able to function." Simultaneously, Hitler considered it necessary to complete the encirclement of Leningrad, to free up Finnish army forces and secure the northern flank. The dispute reached its climax when Colonel General Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, was summoned to headquarters for a personal report. Guderian, who had a reputation as a tank genius, strongly advocated for continuing the offensive on Moscow. He argued that his tanks could reach the Soviet capital before the onset of the muddy season if they received priority in supply and were reinforced by infantry divisions. Hitler listened to Guderian, but remained adamant. The decision was made to shift the main efforts to the flanks. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group received orders to turn south, into the rear of the Soviet forces' Kiev grouping, and Hepner's 4th Panzer Group was to intensify the offensive on Leningrad. This decision caused a real shock in the general staff. Halder recorded in his diary, "The Führer interfered with operational command in the most detrimental way. He is tearing our plan of operations to pieces without understanding the essence of strategy." Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Wehrmacht, tried to find a compromise, suggesting a sequential solution to the tasks. First, complete operations on the flanks, and then strike Moscow with all forces. But time was working against the German army. Every day of delay brought closer the autumn mud and winter cold. The turn of the tank groups from the Moscow direction had far-reaching consequences. On the one hand, this decision led to a major tactical success: the encirclement of the Soviet forces' Kiev grouping. On the other hand, it gave the Red Army precious time to strengthen its defenses in the Moscow direction. Historians still debate who was right in this strategic discussion. Some believe that concentrating all forces on the Moscow direction could have led to success. Others point out that without securing the flanks, an offensive on Moscow would have been an adventure. But the fact remains. On August 21, 1941, Guderian's tanks turned south, and the fate of Operation Barbarossa was sealed. September 1941 became the month of the Wehrmacht's greatest tactical triumph, and, simultaneously, its strategic miscalculation. After Guderian's tank group turned south, an operation began that went down in history as the Kiev Cauldron, the largest encirclement of troops in all of World War II. On September 16th, Guderian's and Kleist's tank wedges closed east of Kiev in the Lovitsa area, cutting off retreat routes for 5 Soviet armies. The 5th, 21st, 26th, 37th, and partially the 38th armies were caught in the ring. The scale of the catastrophe was unprecedented. 665,000 Soviet soldiers and officers were captured, and more than 3,000 artillery pieces and 800 tanks were seized or destroyed. Hitler exulted, calling this victory the greatest battle in world history. German newspapers were full of headlines about the complete annihilation of the Bolshevik armies. However, behind this tactical triumph lay a strategic error that soon became evident. The turn to Kiev cost Army Group Center precious time. The entire month of September, the last month of relatively dry weather before the autumn muddy season, was spent on operations on the flanks instead of a decisive dash to Moscow. The commander of Army Group Center, von Bock, wrote with alarm in his diary, "We are winning battles but losing time, and time is now more precious than blood." General Guderian, whose tanks covered more than 400 kilometers southward in 2 weeks and then the same distance back, later called the Kiev operation a Pyrrhic victory. His tank divisions lost up to 40% of their equipment, not so much in battles as due to mechanical breakdowns and a lack of spare parts. The crews were exhausted by continuous marches. Meanwhile, the Soviet command used this pause to strengthen defenses in the Moscow direction. Under the leadership of General Zhukov, new defensive lines were hastily created, and reserves were brought in from Siberia and the Far East. Divisions transferred from eastern military districts were fully staffed and had combat experience from recent battles with the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol. They became the backbone of the new defense line. Marshal Shaposhnikov, chief of the General Staff of the Red Army, developed a detailed plan for the defense of the capital, taking into account all possible directions of a German strike. the Kiev operation became a turning point in the entire campaign of 1941. By destroying a large group of Soviet troops, the Germans not only did not come closer to their main goal, Moscow, but also gave the enemy what he lacked most: time. When the Wehrmacht finally resumed its offensive on the Soviet capital in early October, the weather had already begun to change. The first rains turned the roads into a muddy mess, and night frosts hampered equipment. Tanks that could cover hundreds of kilometers on dry ground now struggled to cover even a dozen. The Kiev victory, so impressive in the numbers of prisoners and trophies, turned out to be the very point at which the war of annihilation began to turn into a war of attrition, precisely the scenario that the German command had so sought to avoid. On September 30th, 1941, a meeting was held at the Führer's headquarters, where Hitler announced the start of the decisive operation to capture Moscow. The codename Typhoon reflected the very essence of the plan: a swift, crushing blow that was supposed to sweep away Soviet defenses and open the way to Moscow. After the triumph in Kiev, the German command was full of optimism. Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal von Bock, received significant reinforcements. It now included the 9th and 4th Field Armies, as well as 3 panzer groups, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. A total of 78 divisions, including 14 tank and 8 motorized divisions, a powerful fist created to deliver a decisive blow. Against this armada, the Soviet command could field the forces of 3 fronts: Western, Reserve, and Bryansk, numbering about 120 divisions. However, most Soviet formations were seriously weakened by previous battles and had only 30 to 50% of their authorized strength. The German offensive began on October 2nd with an attack by Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group in the Bryansk Front's sector. The next day, the main forces of Army Group Center went on the offensive. The first days of Operation Typhoon brought impressive successes to the Wehrmacht. Tank wedges broke through Soviet defenses and rushed deep into the territory. On October 6th, an encirclement ring closed around 6 Soviet armies in the Vyazma area. The 19th, 20th, 24th, 32nd Armies, as well as parts of the 33rd and 43rd Armies, a total of about 600,000 men, found themselves in the cauldron. Simultaneously to the south in the Bryansk area, 3 armies of the Bryansk front, about 350,000 soldiers, were encircled. It seemed that the scenario of the first days of the war was repeating itself. German generals triumphed. General Huppner, commander of the 4th Panzer Group, reported to headquarters. "The battle for Moscow has been won. The enemy is defeated and incapable of recovering." The road to the Soviet capital seemed open. By mid-October, German tanks had advanced up to 300 kilometers, capturing Kaluga, Mozhaisk, Kalinin. Less than 100 kilometers remained to Moscow. However, it was at this moment that Operation Typhoon began to lose momentum. Autumn rains turned the roads into an impassable quagmire. The famous Russian Rasputitsa, mud season, began. Tanks and vehicles literally drowned in the mud. The advance, which in the first days was measured in tens of kilometers, now shrank to just a few. Soviet troops, trapped in encirclement, did not lay down their arms and continued fierce resistance, tying down significant enemy forces. Simultaneously, new defensive lines were hastily created on the approaches to Moscow. Hundreds of thousands of Muscovites, women, elderly, teenagers, dug anti-tank ditches and built fortifications. Fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East were transferred to defend the capital. Stalin decided not to evacuate the government from Moscow, which had enormous moral significance. On November 7th, a traditional military parade was held on Red Square, from which troops marched directly to the front. This bold move demonstrated the determination of the Soviet leadership to defend the capital to the last. Operation Typhoon which began so successfully for the Wehrmacht, gradually turned into an exhausting battle of attrition. Precisely the scenario that the German command had so desperately tried to avoid. By mid-October 1941, the German command encountered an adversary it had not accounted for in its calculations: Russian nature. Autumn rains transformed dirt roads into impassable quagmires and fields into viscous mire. The famous Rasputitsa, the seasonal impassability of roads, began, a phenomenon well known to locals but a shock to German soldiers. Tanks, which had only recently swiftly cut through Soviet defenses, now helplessly churned in the mud. Powerful German engines roared at full throttle, but their tracks only sank deeper into the sticky sludge. Infantry was forced to march on foot, knee-deep in mud, while heavy artillery became hopelessly bogged down. The commander of one tank division bitterly noted in his diary, "We can move neither forward nor backward. We simply stand in this accursed swamp." The German army, renowned for its motorized might, suddenly found itself paralyzed. Supplying forward units became a true nightmare for quartermaster services. Trucks couldn't get through on the washed-out roads, and soldiers had to carry ammunition and provisions themselves. Fuel consumption increased several-fold. Vehicles consumed it just trying to get out of the mud. And then nature delivered a second blow. In early November, early frosts struck. Temperatures sharply dropped to -15 degrees. The mud froze, turning into an uneven, hard surface with sharp edges that cut rubber tires and tracks. German equipment, lacking winter lubricants, began to fail. Engines wouldn't start in the cold, and metal parts became brittle and broke. Soldiers, dressed in summer uniforms, suffered from the cold. General Guderian wrote in his memoirs, "We were completely unprepared for winter. We had neither winter clothing, nor winter oils for engines, nor antifreeze for cooling systems." The Wehrmacht, which had planned to complete the campaign before the onset of cold weather, was caught off guard. This was not an accident or bad luck. It was a consequence of a strategic miscalculation. The German command, confident of a quick victory, simply had not foreseen such a scenario. When quartermasters requested winter uniforms in September, they were told that the war would end before winter. Now, soldiers paid for this overconfidence with frostbite and pneumonia. Cases of frostbite on extremities multiplied exponentially. By the end of November, losses from the cold exceeded combat losses. Soviet troops, in contrast, were equipped for winter conditions. Soldiers wore padded jackets, felt boots, and ear-flapped hats. Their weapons were adapted to low temperatures, using special lubricants. T-34 tanks with wide tracks overcame snowdrifts more easily than German vehicles. Natural conditions, which became a catastrophe for the invaders, turned into an ally for the defenders. The weather factor exacerbated the already complex logistical problems of the Wehrmacht. Stretched communications, a shortage of transport, destroyed infrastructure, all this, combined with the Rasputitsa and frosts, created a cumulative effect that paralyzed the German offensive. Operation Barbarossa stalled in the Russian mud and froze in the Russian snows, failing to achieve its main objective. The first months of the war showed that the Soviet war machine, despite devastating blows, was not completely destroyed. From the initial shock and chaos, the Red Army gradually transitioned to organized resistance. This process was not instantaneous. It was painful, with enormous sacrifices, but relentless. Already by August 1941, the first signs of a restructuring of Soviet defense became apparent. One of the key factors was the unprecedented scale of industrial evacuation. Over 1,500 large enterprises were dismantled and transported to the eastern regions of the country, to the Urals, Siberia, Central Asia. Workers and engineers toiled around the clock, often under bombardments. Echelons with equipment moved eastward, while trains with troops and materiel moved in the opposite direction. Upon arriving at their new location, factories began producing goods literally in the open air, while buildings were being constructed. The tank factory in Kharkov was evacuated to Nizhny Tagil, and within 8 weeks, the first T-34s rolled off the assembly line. In parallel, human resources were mobilized. Millions of new soldiers were called up to the army. Women replaced men at the machines. Teenagers stood at workbenches, barely reaching them. The entire country turned into a single military camp. The State Defense Committee, created in the first days of the war, concentrated all power in its hands. Decisions were made quickly and implemented without question. The command system, paralyzed in the first days of the war, gradually recovered. Special attention was paid to creating strategic reserves. New armies were formed deep in the rear. If in June-July, the Germans constantly encountered scattered, poorly organized units, by autumn they increasingly met organized resistance from fresh, fully staffed divisions. The transfer of troops from the Far East played a large role. Having received information from his intelligence agent, Richard Sorge, that Japan did not plan to attack the USSR, Stalin decided to transfer 10 divisions from Siberia and Primoria to the west. These units, hardened in battles with the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol, had combat experience and high morale. German soldiers noted with surprise the appearance on the front of fighters in Siberian sheepskin coats, fighting with unprecedented resilience. The tactics of Soviet troops also gradually changed. If at the beginning of the war they tried to hold a rigid line of defense, which led to encirclements, now a more flexible system was applied. Troops retreated to pre-prepared lines, wearing down the enemy and gaining time. Commanders learned from their own mistakes. Special attention was paid to anti-tank defense, the main means of combating German tank wedges. By November, the balance of power on the front began to change. If in June the Wehrmacht had overwhelming superiority, now in many sectors the forces were equal. German divisions, receiving no reinforcements, melted away in continuous battles. Soviet troops, however, were constantly reinforced by reserves. The enemy was still strong, but no longer seemed invincible. November 15, 1941. This day went down in history as the beginning of the decisive battle of Operation Barbarossa. After a 2-week pause caused by the muddy season, the German command resumed its offensive on Moscow. Army Group Center struck in 3 directions: on Klin and Solnechnogorsk from the north, on Istra and Zvenigorod from the west, on Tula from the south. Hitler demanded that the Soviet capital be taken at all costs before winter set in. German tanks broke through Soviet defenses in several places and rushed towards Moscow. Catastrophe seemed inevitable. On November 27th, advanced units of the Wehrmacht reached the Moscow-Volga Canal, captured Klin, Solnechnogorsk, and crossed the Istra. Only 25 kilometers remained to the outskirts of the capital, a day's march. German officers could already discern the golden domes of Moscow's churches through their binoculars. In these critical days, command of Moscow's defense was entrusted to General Zhukov. He pulled all available reserves to the threatened directions. Every meter of land was turned into a fortified line. Anti-tank guns were installed directly on the city streets. Muscovites formed divisions of the People's Militia. However, the Wehrmacht's offensive momentum waned with each passing day. Freezing temperatures, reaching 30 degrees below zero, paralyzed German equipment. Soldiers, dressed in summer uniforms, massively suffered from frostbite. Supplies virtually ceased. By early December, the German offensive finally ran out of steam. The Germans reached points 30 kilometers from Moscow, but could not advance further. On December 5th, something happened that the German command considered impossible. The Red Army launched a counteroffensive. Fresh Siberian divisions, transferred from the Far East, struck at the exhausted German units. The suddenness of the Soviet counterstrike was complete. German soldiers, psychologically tuned for the final push to Moscow, were not ready for defense. Tank divisions, having lost most of their equipment, could not maneuver in the deep snow. Within 2 weeks, Soviet troops pushed the enemy back 100 to 200 kilometers from the capital. The Blitzkrieg, on which the entire Barbarossa plan was based, collapsed. The war, which Hitler planned to finish in 8 to 10 weeks, turned into a protracted confrontation, for which Germany was unprepared. The collapse of Operation Barbarossa had deep economic roots, which became apparent with the transformation of a lightning war into a protracted one. Germany, contrary to popular belief, had not fully shifted its economy to a war footing by the summer of 1941. Hitler, fearing a decline in the population's living standards and a rise in discontent, long postponed the full mobilization of resources. German industry worked only 1 or 2 shifts. The production of luxury goods and consumer items continued, and the share of military spending in national income was significantly lower than in Great Britain or the USSR. Albert Speer, who later became Minister of Armaments, admitted, "We were preparing for a blitzkrieg, not a long war of attrition." This mindset permeated all aspects of military economic planning. Reserves of strategic raw materials, fuel, and ammunition were created with a campaign duration of no more than 3 to 4 months in mind. When the war dragged on, these reserves began to deplete, and the system for their replenishment worked intermittently. The problem of fuel became particularly acute. By December 1941, tank divisions were receiving only 30% of the necessary amount of fuel. The contrast with Soviet economic mobilization was striking. The USSR, despite losing crucial industrial regions, managed to reorient its economy to a war footing in the shortest possible time. The workday was extended to 12 hours, and a 7-day workweek was introduced. All resources were directed to the needs of the front. Women and teenagers replaced men at the machines. Evacuated fact orders began production as soon as their equipment was unloaded. By the end of '41, the decline in production had given way to growth. German generals were astonished to find that, instead of the expected collapse of the Soviet war machine, they were faced with a growing stream of new equipment and reinforcements. The economic model of blitzkrieg proved untenable in the face of total war. Germany began frantically restructuring its economy, but precious time had been lost. The decision for full mobilization of resources was made only after the defeat near Moscow, when it became clear that the war would take on a protracted nature. Nazi Germany, counting on a lightning victory, lost the economic battle even before it began. The psychological state of the opposing armies played no less a role than tanks and aircraft. In the summer of 1941, the moods in the Wehrmacht and the Red Army presented a striking contrast. German soldiers, intoxicated by easy victories in Europe, were confident in their superiority. Letters home were full of phrases about a stroll to the east and promises to return before the leaves fall. Many carried cameras to capture their triumphant march through conquered Russia. This self-confidence was reinforced by ideological indoctrination. Propaganda depicted Soviet soldiers as subhumans, incapable of organized resistance. One German officer wrote, "We feel like demigods among these primitive creatures." Soviet fighters, on the contrary, were demoralized by the rapid retreat and immense losses. Many units found themselves encircled, lost contact with command, and experienced a severe shortage of ammunition and provisions. Cases of panic and desertion were not uncommon. Political workers struggled to maintain discipline. However, by the autumn of 1941, the psychological pendulum began to swing in the opposite direction. German soldiers, encountering fierce resistance near Smolensk and Kiev, began to realize that the war would be long and bloody. Alarming entries appeared in diaries about endless expanses, stretched communications, and a lack of supplies. The Russian nature was particularly oppressive. First, debilitating heat and dust, then autumn mud, which turned roads into impassable swamps. With the onset of cold weather, German morale began to plummet rapidly. Soldiers in summer uniforms froze in hastily dug dugouts. Frostbite became a widespread phenomenon. "We were not ready for this hell," wrote one sergeant. "Every morning in our company, several people do not wake up. They simply freeze to death in their sleep." Despair intensified with the realization that the promised quick victory had not materialized, and ahead lay the endless Russian winter. In the Red Army, on the contrary, a psychological transformation was taking place. The initial shock of the German invasion was replaced by a growing determination to defend their homeland. The realization of the invaders' true goals played a key role. The atrocities of the occupiers in the captured territories, the mass executions of civilians, the burned villages, all this turned the war in the eyes of Soviet soldiers into a sacred struggle for survival. "There is nowhere to retreat. Moscow is behind us." These words of political instructor Klotchkov became a symbol of the new mood in the army. The spirit of resistance grew stronger every day. Propaganda efforts also played their part. The newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda and Yuri Leviton's radio broadcasts boosted morale. Konstantin Simonov's poem, "Wait for Me," was copied by hand and passed from trench to trench. By December 1941, when the Soviet counteroffensive near Moscow began, the psychological advantage had definitively shifted to the Red Army. Soviet soldiers fought on their land, defending their homes and families. The Germans, exhausted and frostbitten, increasingly wondered why they found themselves in these endless snowy deserts thousands of kilometers from home. Morale, an intangible but decisive factor in war, became one of the reasons for the collapse of Operation Barbarossa. For 7 decades, historians worldwide have been analyzing the reasons for the failure of Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Discussions continue to this day, giving rise to new interpretations and assessments. An analysis of the key strategic miscalculations of the German command allows us to understand why a plan that seemed flawless on paper collapsed when confronted with reality. The first and perhaps fundamental miscalculation was the catastrophic underestimation of the enemy. German strategists viewed the Soviet Union as a colossus with feet of clay, a state with an inefficient economy, a weak army, and a fragile political system. They were convinced that a powerful initial blow would be sufficient to make the entire Soviet structure crumble. General Jodl wrote in his memorandum, "Russia will be defeated in a single short campaign." This illusion, reinforced by racial prejudices and ideological stereotypes, prevented an adequate assessment of the Soviet system's mobilization capabilities, the people's resilience, and the leadership's ability to organize resistance. The second fatal miscalculation was the dispersal of forces along 3 strategic directions. The classic principle of military art requires the concentration of efforts on the main direction. However, Operation Barbarossa envisaged simultaneous offensives on Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. Historian Basil Littlehart, analyzing this aspect, noted, "The Germans wanted to achieve too much at once, with the result that they achieved nothing." This error was particularly evident in August-September, when, instead of a decisive push towards Moscow, armored groups were directed to the flanks. The third miscalculation, which had fatal consequences, was the complete unpreparedness for a winter campaign. The Wehrmacht planned to conclude the war before the onset of cold weather. So winter uniforms, antifreeze for equipment, and special lubricants were practically absent. When frosts struck in November, the German army found itself defenseless against the Russian winter. British historian Richard Overy emphasized, "It was not so much the Russian soldier as the Russian frost that stopped the German offensive." The fourth strategic error was the underestimation of the spatial factor. Enormous distances, impassable roads, and stretched communications. All this created a logistical nightmare for the German command. With every kilometer of advance deep into Soviet territory, supplying troops became an increasingly difficult task. By the autumn of '41, the advanced units were 600 to 700 kilometers from supply bases, which exceeded the capabilities of the Wehrmacht's transport system. The fifth factor, often overlooked, was the underestimation of the USSR's economic potential. The evacuation of industry to the east and the rapid restoration of military production came as an unpleasant surprise to the German command. While the Wehrmacht faced a growing shortage of equipment and ammunition, Soviet industry was increasing its output of armaments. There are also alternative viewpoints on the possibility of Operation Barbarossa's success. Some historians, including John Erickson, believe that even with more competent planning, Germany lacked the resources to win a war against the USSR. Others, like David Glantz, argue that concentrating all forces on the Moscow direction in the summer of '41 could have led to the capture of the Soviet capital and radically changed the course of the war. However, most researchers agree on one thing. Operation Barbarossa was an adventure based on an overestimation of its own strengths and an underestimation of the enemy. The collapse of this plan became a turning point not only for the Great Patriotic War, but for the entire Second World War. The failure of Operation Barbarossa became a turning point not only for the Great Patriotic War, but also for the entire Second World War. This event shifted the strategic balance of power and dashed Hitler's hopes for world domination. December 1941 marked a fundamental change in the global conflict. The initiative began to pass from the Axis powers to the anti-Hitler coalition. For the first time since the start of the war, the German army, which had seemed invincible, suffered a strategic defeat. The myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility was shattered on the snow-covered fields of the Moscow region. This had immense psychological significance for the entire world. In the capitals of subjugated European countries, people listened with hope to radio reports from the Eastern Front. Every kilometer the German troops retreated instilled belief in the possibility of liberation. Churchill, upon learning of the Soviet counteroffensive, remarked in a close circle, "Now I know that Hitler will lose the war." For the United States, which entered the war after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, '41, Soviet successes became an important factor in shaping global strategy. The resistance of the Soviet Union gave Americans precious time to mobilize their industrial potential. The failure of Barbarossa had far-reaching geopolitical consequences. Hitler was forced to switch to strategic defense in the East, which meant the collapse of the Blitzkrieg concept that underpinned all German military doctrine. The Third Reich found itself drawn into a protracted war of attrition, precisely the scenario the Führer had so desperately tried to avoid. Germany, lacking sufficient resources for a prolonged confrontation, was doomed to defeat, although the agony stretched on for another 3.5 years. For the Soviet Union, repelling the German offensive was not only a military, but also a moral victory. The country, which many Western experts had written off in the summer of '41, proved its viability. Under the most difficult conditions, the Soviet people demonstrated incredible resilience and the ability to mobilize all resources to repel the enemy. It was during this period that the foundations for future victory were laid. The economy, reoriented for war, began to increase arms production. Command personnel gained invaluable combat experience. A strategy was forged that ultimately led to Berlin. The Battle of Moscow became the first link in a chain of battles that changed the course of the war. It was followed by Stalingrad, Kursk, Operation Bagration. The failure of Barbarossa also influenced the post-war world order. It was then that the contours of the future world order began to form. The Soviet Union, having withstood the deadly struggle with Nazism, established itself as one of the two superpowers of the post-war era. Its sphere of influence expanded far to the west, encompassing Eastern European countries. The United States finally abandoned its policy of isolationism and assumed the role of leader of the Western world. Europe, which had dominated international relations for centuries, lost its central position. A bipolar world was born, defining international relations for the next 4 decades. The historical significance of the failure of Operation Barbarossa cannot be overstated. It was not just a military defeat. It was the collapse of an entire ideological concept based on racial superiority and the right of the strong. Nazi Germany, which claimed a 1,000-year reign, suffered defeat in a decisive battle. The world was saved from the prospect of plunging into a new dark age. Humanity received a chance for development along the path of democracy and respect for human rights. The lessons of that winter of 1941 are relevant today. They remind us of the fragility of peace, of the danger of ideologies based on hatred and supremacy, of the price that must be paid for freedom. They teach us that even the most powerful aggressor can be stopped if people unite against him, ready to defend their land and their future. This is the enduring significance of those events that changed the course of world history.